Teamwork isn't just nice to have in business, it's the undisputed competitive advantage. When your team members work as a unified force, your whole operation benefits through higher productivity, thriving creativity, and unstoppable momentum. Welcome to the Impactful Teamwork Podcast, where we share with you strategies and tactics to help you develop game-changing teams so that you and your business can make a real difference in the world. Welcome. On this week's edition of Impactful Teamwork, I want to talk a little bit about remote working and managing teams remotely. This episode really has been prompted by a conversation I was having with a coaching client this week, who was actually lamenting the fact that working in this hybrid way was making his life a lot more complicated because he was finding it difficult to build connection and relationships with people at distance. So I just thought it would be helpful for us to revisit. We've been working remotely now for 4 or 5 years. Although we are seeing a shift for some organizations, there's still a large number of team members that are working 1 or 2 days a week at home. And for those of us that are working completely remotely, I think there's a real need for us to recognize the importance and the need for us to focus on how do we build conscious connections with people in a remote environment, because we know that relationships drive business. And when we don't have good relationships with our team members and with our colleagues, it's so much more difficult to get things done. And yet there's some challenges with leading teams remotely. And I think it would make sense for us today to delve into some of those and to look at some solutions that we might be able to put in place to try and mitigate some of these challenges. I think the whole virtual working is based on the fact that we have to adopt a mindset that can deal with multiple polarities. And what do I mean by that? What is a polarity? A polarity refers to two opposites that are both desirable and necessary. We need both of them, but they're almost in conflict of each other. So the three kind of main polarities that we see existing in virtual teams are that we need to accomplish tasks, and at the same time, we need to foster those relationships I was just talking about. We want to embrace individuality, and at the same time, the collective identity. And the third polarity is all about how do we invest in technology and manage expenses. And the challenge for leaders is that we need to pay attention to both sides of these polarities, despite the fact that they are conflicting. Because if we focus on one at the expense of another, it will lead to problems within the organization. So this really requires an either-or mindset. So we've got to move from a situation where we've got an exclusive focus on tasks and getting down to business to ensure that the team's work is delivered on time and that progress is made and that team members are held accountable. So we've got to manage that focus on tasks. And against that, we have to notice that if we put an overemphasis on these tasks, it can result in teams that lack trust and supportive behaviors. And the team is not really in a strong position to weather significant challenges. And on the other hand, we've got this exclusive focus on relationships. And we know that great relationships build a well-integrated team that supports productive collaboration, increased team orientation, and fosters a culture of support and positive relationships. But an overemphasis on these relationships may result in missed deadlines, losing sight of team objectives. So, what do leaders do faced with this dilemma? Because the answer is, of course, that they need to focus on both. And there's positive and negative consequences of each side of the pair. So, what I'd invite you to do is actually grab a pen and on a large piece of paper, just draw a big plus in the middle of the paper. And on the top left-hand side, put the word task. And on the top right-hand side, put the word relationships. So if we go to the top left-hand corner, we've got the positive aspects of polarity. So if we're thinking about this task versus relationship, the positive aspects of the left-hand side is work is delivered on time, team members are proud of their accomplishments, and team members are accountable for their work. And then under that, in the bottom left-hand side, I'd like you to put the negative aspects of the task polarity. We've got weak relationships between team members. We've got no team cohesion, and members fail to support each other. Now let's go to the other side, the top right-hand side. The positive aspect of the relationship polarity is that the relationships that are built support collaboration. Team members support each other with extra effort, and the team is more resilient and agile. But the negative consequences are that deadlines are missed, team members lose motivation, and team members lack accountability. What I think is great, and what we have seen that works really well, is that technology can massively improve this situation. If you think about it, most of you will be running meetings with virtual team members via Teams or Zoom or some other video-based platform. Imagine if you never even saw your colleagues, how that would exacerbate the distance between you. So actually, some of our modern business technology supports the task orientation. We've got a lot of team members staying connected via Teams channels throughout the day, email, WhatsApp. The ways that we're building relationships and staying in contact with each other have really changed dramatically in the last few years. But I think it's important that we recognize that even with all of these ways of interacting with each other, there can still be a danger that our communication is very transactional. You communicate with colleagues because you need some information or you need some input for a project you're doing. But my invitation to you is, how can you craft some conscious time into every single meeting you have with somebody so that you can start building some real relationship and rapport with them? Now, this is obviously easier to do with team members that maybe you have previously met in person. And that's why I'm a massive advocate for teams actually at least once or twice a year coming together and actually meeting face to face. There is nothing that beats face to face interaction for building relationships and building rapport. Conscious connection is very important that we think about that in a virtual world. I have some clients that within their teams, they have meetings that are effectively virtual connection days where they don't talk anything about business. The sole purpose of the meeting is to actually get to know their colleagues better. And of course, when we were in an environment where everyone was working together in co-located, then this happened just naturally. It was what I call water cooler talk. You'd bump into somebody when you were making a coffee in the morning and you might find out what was going on for them. You might even arrange to go out for lunch with somebody when you're in the workplace. But all of these things aren't happening. And of course, now the challenge is that so much communication in the workplace happens in these informal networks. I remember when I was in the corporate world, I used to learn so much from just wandering around the office, overhearing conversations, going to talk to colleagues about what was going on. None of this was in the formal chain of communication, for want of a better word. And armed with that information, I was able to make better decisions for my team because I was more aware of what was going on. And I also have a real concern because for new team members joining organizations, a lot of what I remember when I first joined Panel Foster as a hospitality research analyst, a lot of what I learned wasn't on any kind of formal training plan. I learned because I overheard colleagues in our shared office talking about things. I observed the way that they dealt with clients on the phone, how they dealt with problems and challenges. And that was the way I learned. I learned by what I call learning by osmosis, by seeing everything that was going on around me. And of course, this is massively lacking now with people working remotely. So this is going to be a real challenge for business as we go forward, is how do we get that skills transfer working effectively? As leaders, we really have to listen carefully when team members start talking about problems, challenges, difficulties, and frustrations they encounter in their work. And we've really got to think about how do we cultivate the team's ability to hold two opposing ideas in their head at the same time? How do we help team members look for synergies in seemingly opposing ideas in order to increase team effectiveness? So that is a real challenge for us. And something that as leaders means that we need to pay even more attention than ever. And regular listeners to the podcast will know that I'm a massive proponent of how do we as leaders pay more attention? How do we be more present? Because a lot of this communication is in the nuances of body language. And unless we're really paying attention, we don't notice that happening. So I'd like to suggest there are three critical factors that are essential for virtual team success. We know no two teams are alike, and therefore success managing the polarities we've just discussed varies by team. Some research by the Center for Creative Leadership identified that teams who manage polarities well improve their outcome by 5%, although in some teams in their study, performance actually improved by over 50%. So what was contributing to that massive increase in performance of over 50%? They identified three areas that you can't ignore in virtual teams, and these are technology, time zones, physical distance can lead to long hours and burnout, and team structure. You really want to consider who's involved, committed they are. So let's just delve a little bit into technology, how real-time connection helps teams feel less virtual. We know that if teams can communicate in real time, that enables them to work much more collaboratively together. And so planning and decision making and work monitoring and execution can happen in real time. But of course, technology also poses challenges to virtual teams. We get technology glitches on calls, connectivity issues, and different team members have different levels of comfort with using the technology. Even now, and I think about today, I've been coaching some clients in different areas of the world, and quite often I have been experiencing Teams or Zooms drop out. The whole internet goes, particularly when the weather's bad. I've noticed that. But also the stagnation when somebody starts talking and then it sounds like they're in a black hole for a moment and there's a delay and a disconnect. And that can actually be quite disconcerting because you're not quite sure what you miss in that moment of what your colleague is saying. So it does mean that we need to provide our team members with some training in how to use the technology so that people feel that they are supported and engaged and that the leadership is supporting how they are doing. And in some instances, it also means that we need to be providing team members with the technology. Maybe it's a laptop, maybe it's a video webcam, maybe it's a microphone. We actually need to be providing people with the technology in order to be successful. And I think in terms of technology, it's always very helpful to have a really clear policy on the kind of collaboration tools that you're going to be using so that everyone knows the channels to look for information. There are a myriad of ways that we can communicate with each other, and we need to be aware of what the preferred method is within our organization or within our team. But I think we also need to be cognizant that team members do require some quiet time to actually get work done. I know that I turn off all of my notifications because if I was sitting here working all day with notifications coming in, it would drive me insane. I'd be continually distracted and never get anything done. So again, we're walking a fine line here with technology. We want the technology to support us, but at the same time, we also need to ensure it's not a distraction from actually getting anything done. Because if you're not careful, you could just spend all day just responding to things pinging on your Teams channel or whatever notification platform you're using and actually never get any work done. And it's a bit like email, right? Good email protocol now is to maybe check your email twice a day at the beginning or the end of the day. And throughout the day, you turn it off because it's too distracting. And maybe that's something you want to look at with other notifications on your computer. And what I always say to people is, you can always let your colleagues know how they can contact you if something is needed urgently. So it might be, God forbid, they actually have to pick up the phone to you and call you. One thing we do need to be careful of, though, in the really global world that we live is about time zones. Because many of my clients work across the world in different time zones, and we need to ensure that everyone can be protected from burnout. A lot of my clients work with colleagues on the west coast of the US, so that's 8 hours behind us in the UK, and they're also working with colleagues in Asia at the same time. And it's physically not possible for their day to run 16 hours long. So I think if if we've got teams in multiple time zones like that, we have to be really clear on when we're going to be available and how we're going to be available. And I think about a client I was coaching recently who had exactly this problem. They had a short window of time, which was between 4 and 6, when his office on the west coast of the US was open. So what we agreed with them was that any really time critical calls would happen in that sort of 4 to 6 hour time slot. But he would provide them with a means that they could contact him if it was 10 p.m. UK time, for example, which is obviously the afternoon on the West Coast. He would provide them with a way that they could contact him if it was something that he absolutely needed his input on at that moment in time. Because that prevented him from having burnout, because he was in danger of sitting there all night, not connecting with his family, with his spouse, with his kids, because he was always worried about what was going on his phone. He was checking his email all night. So we need to be really cognizant of where our team are located and how we can all work together so that we can minimize any of that burnout from working from massively extended hours. And that might mean that we have to provide some flexible hours that people can work in order to accommodate the time. And lastly, we want to think about a team structure, and we want to think about who's involved and how committed they are. Because with any team, we want to ensure it's of an optimal size. Because teams with overcommitted members, and what do I mean by overcommitted members? I mean that they are members of multiple teams. They're often the ones that we have discovered in the research don't prioritize and leverage their polarities particularly well. And as a result of that, the team effectiveness suffers. What is an optimally functioning team? It typically has between 5 and 9 members. So that's what I would suggest. Try and keep teams at about 7 members, because that's enough people that you've got enough time to connect with and work with without being overwhelmed by everyone around you. And it's also really important to figure out which team members are core team members and which are peripheral. So the core team members are key contributors, and they're highly involved in the project, for example, that we're working on, and they're expected to stay with the team over time. And you want to contrast that with peripheral team members that support the work of the team, but they may be less involved, and they may only be on the team for a short period of time. We also need to ensure that when we're looking at teams, that we're looking very holistically at the business, because there is a danger that each leader of each project looks at their team, and you could find that Joe Bloggs ends up being a core team member on multiple teams simultaneously, and that actually isn't going to be good for the success of the business. So definitely remote teams are here to stay. And as leaders, I think our challenge is, how do we learn to develop the skills to navigate those polarities? This need for relationship and this need for results at the same time. And how do we consciously think about how do we build relationships with team members that we don't meet or have rarely met in person? And my invitation to you would be to think about, how can you get your team together once or twice a year so that people can really build true, tangible relationships with each other? So I'd love to hear what strategies and tactics you're using to manage your teams remotely. What's been working well, what hasn't worked so well, and what are the lessons you've learned in the last few years? So until next week, have an amazing time. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to the Impactful Teamwork Podcast. Please stay tuned for future episodes and do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating on your favourite platform. Recommendations are essential for attracting new listeners. Please follow us on social media at Julia Felton and at Business Horsepower. And if there are any topics you'd like us to cover on future episodes, please do let me know. Remember, you and your team are always making an impact. What impact will you make today?